And even today, I don't think Tony can let his marketing skills and his communication skills drop, and I believe is still writing for his own local community in the Dilston area. So Tony, we welcome you and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to the friends for inviting me. What you're going to hear today is pretty much a story of a city boy who saw the light and came to this wonderful state and this wonderful city nearly 50 years ago. And I'm going to tell you the story of that journey. Just briefly about the title, I've called it A Wine and Women, partly because I'm a writer and I wanted something catchy that might bring people in. But really, when you're asked to do something like this, I mean, I've spoken to many groups over many years, but I've never had to talk about myself. I've always talked about something where I had some degree of expertise. And this forces you to examine your life, have a look back and do a bit of introspection. And so I realised, obviously, that wine has been a central theme of my life, both professionally and personally, and I've had a lifetime fascination with it. But the women part, when I really thought back on my life, my youth was dominated by two women who really made me as a man, and that was my grandmother and mother, which I'll get to in a minute. And of course, since I've been in Tasmania, my wife Sue really has been responsible for nearly all the good decisions in my life. So those three women have been very, very instrumental in giving me the wonderful life that I've had, and over 81 years, and look forward to having a bit more. I mean, this is going to sound a bit like a eulogy while I'm still alive, but I can assure you I'm feeling very well. But it's going to be very personal, so I hope it's not also very boring. Let me just start with a cautionary tale. I thought when I was asked to do this talk, I better come and have a look at the previous speaker so that I knew how it worked, what the format was and how I would have to present. On the way in to the museum, I actually tripped over one of those wonderful domed lights that the university have put in their landscaping, and I came an awful cropper and finished up in the LGH for the day, fortunately with no permanent damage, and hopefully my fall wasn't in vain, because you'll notice now that there are warning posts on all the lights, and I imagine they're going to eventually do something about it. But do be careful when you leave today. I was born in 1940 in Sydney. My mother had had two stillbirths before me, so I was a very spoiled and cosseted child. I obviously liked that hairstyle, because you'll notice that 80 years later it hasn't changed, with the exception of a brief spell in the army and national service when I didn't have a choice about it. And these are the women who played a central part in my youth. My grandmother on the left, Elizabeth Grouse, I should say, her married name. She was an extraordinary woman, a very talented musician. She was regarded as a child prodigy, and I've seen the newspaper clippings to support that. As a pianist in her youth. She married, had two children, my mother and an older brother. Her husband, Reg, then went off to the First World War in 1917. 5 months later, he was dead, killed in the Battle of Messines in Belgium. My grandmother then had to support two young children. She went and started her own orchestra. This is in the time of the silent movies. And every silent theatre silent movie theatre worth its salt had an orchestra that played along with the silent movies. And the silent movies were a very, very big deal, of course, back in those days. So she was, as far as I can find out, the only female orchestra leader in Australia, well, in Sydney certainly, and probably in Australia at that time. It was a very lucrative and well-paid occupation, and she was able to not only buy her own house, but to buy 2 other cottages, which she rented out. So she did extremely well as a single mum. The middle person is my Auntie Mona, who was my grandmother's sister, and I spent most of my school holidays with them. And of course my mother, who instilled in me the love of language and of books and of writing, which really has sustained me all my life because I've always earned my living through some form of writing over the years. So when I say women and wine, it really has been very, very important to me. We grew up in Sydney, my sister and I. Don't look very promising there, do we? In a very happy and secure childhood. Went on to school. I went to Canterbury High School, where I was a reasonable student. I was in the debating team, and one of my fellow members was a guy called John Howard. And John Howard, of course, went on to fame and fortune. At the time, you would have voted him the boy least likely to succeed if there was a poll. And I can tell you confidentially, and I have the actual proof of this, that he failed general mathematics in the Leaving Certificate and went on to become the Treasurer and the Prime Minister of Australia. He was a year ahead of me at school, so I wasn't actually that close to him. My sister Sue went to Fort Street, and we didn't turn out too badly in the end. My sister went on to a successful career in theatre and television and films, and finished up marrying the well-known English actor Michael Craig, and she now lives with Michael in Wales. I went to Sydney University, typically in those days the first one in my family to attend university, and I found this old photo of me in the university baseball team, and baseball's been a love of mine ever since. Now, I enrolled in the arts. I'd been to an all-boys school at Canterbury High School. I enrolled in arts at the university, where there were 3 females to every male enrolled. And I was really, I was overcome by this. You know, I had very, very little contact with females of my own age up until that time, and I was suddenly thrown into this smorgasbord of women. It didn't help my academic progress. I lasted 2 years at university, and I left because I got sick of not having any money, briefly. And at that time, there were jobs aplenty. I could pick and choose a job. I went out to work in the intention of finishing my degree part-time, and of course never did. Well, in fact I did, but some 30 years later. So my first job was for Columbia Pictures, where I was the assistant to the director of advertising and publicity. Very grandiose title. And I earned £26 a week. That was put up to £28 a week. And I remember, and I still have the letter from from my boss, saying that the managing director has graciously seen fit to increase your wage to £28 per week. I then worked in Wollongong for a while with Channel 4. That was at a time when there were only 2 commercial stations in Sydney, and Rupert Murdoch bought Channel 4 in Wollongong with the intention of building a translator on Bulli Pass and making it the de facto 3rd station in Sydney before the 3rd licence was issued. Now, that all came to nothing in the end, and so I have the distinction shared by many of being sacked by Rupert Murdoch when he dramatically reduced the staff of Channel 4 to what it has become now, just a little rural television station. So I worked in the film industry, went to Melbourne, worked for Hoyt's Theatres in Melbourne. I married in Melbourne, my first marriage. Came back to Sydney, worked in the film industry again. Then I went to work in public relations consultancy. And in those days, you didn't apply for jobs. You were headhunted everywhere. Somebody would say, would you be interested in coming to work for us? I mean, it was a different world, really, back in those days. So then I went to a public relations consultancy where two really important things happened. The first one was, this was the receptionist, who I subsequently married. So I met Sue on the day they walked on the moon, in fact. The second thing that happened to me at that consultancy was that they said, which accounts do you think you'll be able to handle? They said, would you like to do the Penfolds account? And they said, do you know anything about wine? Oh, yes, I said, I've drunk plenty of wine. In fact, I had drunk hardly any wine. I'd had perhaps a glass of Barossa Pearl when we'd been to a ball, but that was about it. I'd grown up in a beer drinking household where wine was rare, never seen. Anyway, I got the Penfolds account. The first job I was given, and I've told this story many times, the first job I was given for Penfolds was to organise a tasting, get the press and the media along to a tasting, which was a vertical tasting of Grange Hermitage. So it was 10 consecutive years of Grange Hermitage, and who was presenting them? Max Schubert, who was the very famous winemaker who created Grange Hermitage. So my first experience of table wine was 10 consecutive years of Grange Hermitage. Now, if anything is going to make you enthusiastic about wine, that was it. I thought, how long has this been going on? And I have been a devotee ever since. The next bit I want to talk about, it's a bit embarrassing. I went to see Hair, the musical. I was a young executive on the upward track. I went to see Hair at the Metro Theatre in King's Cross. And I started to think, maybe there's a bit more to life than the corporate treadmill. And it really, really changed me. I know it sounds terribly trite that something like that changes your life, but it really did. And I started to think about escape and other ways of life. At the time, my marriage was not good. My love for Sue was overwhelming. And so it seemed like a very good opportunity. My wife had a very successful children's wear shop in Woollahra. She was financially independent. We had no children. So I made the best decision I've ever made in my life, which was to leave my wife and to marry Sue and come down to Tasmania. We arrived in Tasmania in 1973, young, fresh-faced city kids. I had grown up in inner Sydney. I didn't know what hay was. I really had no idea of country life. We rented a house at Debiot. It had its own jetty. And I still remember the impressions of Tasmania in those early years. It was just wonderland to me. Crunching over an icy lawn in the morning, picking an apple off a tree. I'd never done that. Picked an apple off a tree and eaten it. Picked oysters off the rocks. We had our own jetty. I used to fish, catch breakfast, go down and get a few oysters. And it wasn't until years later that I found that you shouldn't be eating the oysters out of the Tamar because of the heavy metals. But it doesn't seem to have done me any lasting damage. But we loved it. And before long, we had the chance. I met a chap who was a ag department consultant or extension officer, and he said to me, I know a farmer out at Lilydale who's just bought the neighbouring farm wants to sell off the house on 5 acres. So he said, would you like to meet him? So I said, yes. So out we go, and this was the house. It was a lovely old Federation house built in 1880. It was very derelict. It had broken windows. It had a toilet that didn't work, outside toilet that didn't work. It was a bit of a mess. He said, would you be interested? And I said, yes. Well, how much did you think of for it? And he said, well, we were thinking around about $9,000. Now, you know, kids today hate to hear this story, but we paid $9,000 for a beautiful old, solid Federation house on 5 acres of orchard. At that time, the government was offering what they called the tree pull scheme, where they offered you $1,000 an acre to pull out your fruit trees, and they covered the cost of doing so. We had 4 acres of orchard on the 5 acres. So we got $4,000 back from that. So the whole thing cost me $5,000, which I'm embarrassed about to this day. But it was a wonderful house, and we put an awful lot of work into restoring that back to its former glory. Meantime, I went to work for Frank Bardenhagen at the Lilydale sawmill, and then I met this guy, big bad Buck Emberg, who's left us sadly. But Buck and I, over a beer one night, said, look, you know, there's a real potential here for a country market. And he said, I know a guy who owns the apple shed down at Lalla, and all the orchards had pretty well gone at that time. So the shed was sitting there empty, still with all the old apple sorting equipment in it. So Buck went down to see him, and Ted Armstrong, and he said, Ted, would you be interested in selling us the shed? And Ted said, yes, but you know, it's going to cost you $1,000. So for $1,000, we bought that, which was the old apple shed right on the railway line at Lalla. And we started the Lalla market in 1973. Now, we created a monster. It just took off, and we had to, for the second one, we had to approach a neighbouring farmer and lease one of their paddocks for the car park because it created havoc the first time. So that was a really successful thing. It was the first country market, as far as I know, in Tasmania. And all the local farmers or craftspeople would come in, set up their own stall. They would pay us 10% commission on the honour system, and we ran the market and advertised it and got the people there. After a while, the Lilydale Council started to think, gee, this is a big deal. Lilydale's missing out on this. So, to cut a long story short, they shut us down because we didn't have adequate public toilets, and we moved down to the Lilydale showgrounds. And the market never succeeded down there. It didn't have the same atmosphere. And eventually we came back to the apple shed, where we converted it into a gallery. The gallery was initially started by people you'd remember, George Richardson, Rob Eichen, Blair Gamble, Walt Sutherland, a group of painters who leased the space, and eventually they moved on, and we created it as principally a craft market with a lot of ceramic. In 1976, the first child came along, Elizabeth. We then bought a, I didn't tell her there's going to be a naked picture of her in this presentation. We then bought an orchard down at Lalla, one of the few remaining orchards in the area, because we thought we'd be able to sell our own fruit direct from the market. And we decided, you know, with the arrogance of youth, that we would design and build our own house. I'd never held a hammer, you know, I didn't know the first thing about building, but I thought, how hard can it be? So we designed our own house, and I hired a local farmer to work with me, and over 3 months we built it. We were living in a caravan, as you can see, and Libby was being bathed in the caravan at the time. And we built a 2-storey, I think very beautiful house, using nearly all recycled material, salvage material, that I'm happy to say is still standing today. That was the pit, that was the centre of the house, and it was a recessed pit in front of this big fire. We tried to get the feeling of a cave in there. And I remember a friend of ours, John Webster, who was the Dean of Architecture at UTAS at the time. John used to bring his students out to have a look at the house. And I was never quite sure whether he was bringing them out to show them a wonderful example of an owner-built and designed house, or whether he was saying, this is what happens when you don't use an architect. But it was a wonderful house, and we had, I don't know, I guess about 10 very, very good years there. Okay, at the time we were building the house, Sue was very pregnant with our second child, with John. Libby decided she'd get in on the act as well, on the pregnancy act. The next thing that happened when we'd built that house and moved in, we were still running the market and the gallery, we were approached by a young man called Rob Andrew, who was a teacher. And Rob had this idea of starting an alternative school, a bit like Steiner, but with our own rules and our own principles. We were part of a largely expat community at Lilydale and Lalla, of people who'd moved from various places all over the world looking for that Tasmanian experience. But there were lots of Tasmanians involved too, like the Archers and who gave us the land? Wilson. Mike Wilson, thank you. So anyway, 14 families got together and decided we would start the Mount Arthur Family School. Well, this is still on the orchard when the second ones arrived. Oh, I had promised that I'd include a naked picture of Sue today, and that's what's got a couple of the men along here. And that was in the clawfoot bath in our lovely house at Lalla. Right, the Mount Arthur School, 1983. We all gave, or the men particularly, gave a day a week for a year to the construction of the school. And it was really an extraordinary community effort. It was a really nice piece of social history. And I know Rob Andrews on my back at the moment to write the history of it when I can fit it in. But it was a great social experience for us. And it was a wonderful bonding experience for all those families. And it was a very, very good educational experience. That's the opening of the school in 1984 when we'd completed the building. That's what it looked like inside. It was a wonderful learning environment for those kids. And we just recently had a 40-year reunion, and that's what we all look like now. Older and hopefully a bit wiser. Third child came along, and in 1982, at the time I thought, well, I've got 2 years of my arts degree, why don't I finish my degree? And my main interest at Sydney University had been in archaeology, and that had been my supposed major. So UNE were at that time offering a very good external course in archaeology. So I enrolled in that, and I, to cut a long story short, finished my degree over the next 2 or 3 years, part-time, so that actually by academic qualification I'm an archaeologist, although I've never done any. When I say I've never done any, I did quite a lot of work for Sydney University in my university days, and since I've come down here I've done quite a bit of work for QV Mag on sites like Prime Seal Island and Wyberlina on Flinders Island and various places around the state. but I've never worked professionally, of course, as an archaeologist. Okay, the next part of my wine journey was joining this group. This is the Flying Pigs. It's a wine club that meets once a month. It's been going for over 40 years. And over that time, I estimate we've tasted something like 3,000 wines, which you would think would have taught us something by now, but we don't seem to be getting any better at identifying them. One of the highlights of that was we actually had a wonderful 2 weeks in France, trying the vineyards and living in a shared house in France, which was a great experience. After 14 years of running the market and the Appleshed Gallery and having a wonderful life, I realised, or I think maybe Sue pointed out to me, that I had no superannuation. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to actually go back and work for a living for a while. So I did. I went back and worked as marketing manager for the Launceston College of TAFE. And I had a very, very pleasant 8-9 years there, working in education. During that time, I had a lot of friends in the wine industry. Even though I hadn't worked in it here, I was very friendly with Andrew Perry, with Richard Richardson at Delamere, with Steve Hyde, who's here today, who was running Rotherhithe Vineyard at that time, Jeff Hewitt at Cliff House and Nick Butler at Home Oak, and I knew all these people really well. So the Examiner asked me would I be interested in writing a column on Tasmanian wine, which I started, I don't know, about 1991, I think, and kept going for a decade. The Examiner typically, when the restaurant reviewer retired, said to me, "Oh, well, you write the wine column, you want to do the restaurant reviews as well?" And I said, "Yeah, I've done plenty of eating out, I can do that." And so I then wrote those, which I guess many of you will remember. I wrote the restaurant reviews for restaurants around the state for probably 7 or 8 years. I'd like to now just talk briefly about 6 things that have really been important in my life. The first one's bushwalking. When I was in my 50s, a friend came to me and said, "Why don't we do the overland track?" Now, I thought that ship had sailed. You know, I wasn't particularly fit, and I thought that's a pretty rigorous walk for somebody of my age. But he talked me into it. We went into training, we carried packs full of rocks up Mount Arthur. I went to the gym, you know, which I'd never done before in my life. And we actually did the overland track and thoroughly enjoyed it. Had a great trip down. That was the formation of the Over the Hill Walking Club. Over the hill for obvious reasons. And we then, every year, did a walk in the Tasmanian wilderness, the South Coast Track, Southwest Cape, Windhoek Bay. We've been really all over that wonderful area and that precious area of Tasmania, and it remains one of the great experiences of my life. I only regret now that my knees will not allow me to do it. Second thing, when we moved to Dilston in 2000, we had a tennis court on the property, lovely old clay tennis court, hadn't been used for many years. We refurbished that and we started the Over the Hill Tennis Club. And we've now been playing for many, many years, a wonderful group that keeps me fit, and we have a very, very good après tennis routine. Croquet. This has been a relatively recent find. When I dislocated my shoulder and couldn't play tennis, somebody introduced us to croquet, and we've become quite addicted, to the extent now that I'm actually on a national committee which is seeking to rebrand croquet in Australia, to try and change the image of it from a sport for doddery old people to what it is now, a dynamic international competitive sport. I mean, the world champion at the moment is 23 years old. So we've got the job in front of us, but that's something I've taken on. The next thing that was important in our life was BOFA, the Breath of Fresh Air Film Festival. At the time, Sue and Owen Tilbury, welcome Owen, and Helen, Owen and Sue were on the committee of the Film Society, and Owen came up with the idea of a film festival. Now, being Owen, of course, it had to be a world-class film festival. So we started in 2010, and it soon got a bit too big for Film Society to handle. So Owen decided to take it on, Owen and Helen decided to take it on, and over the next, I guess, 7 or 8 years, we helped, while Owen and Helen did 90% of the work, we helped where we could with the marketing and doing the program and so on. And that was a wonderful trip, and we really thoroughly enjoyed that. And I'm delighted to say that it's still going strong and has adapted to COVID with an online branch. But it was a wonderful time and an important part of our time in Tassie. Another woman who was important in my life was Annie Gregg. Annie I met in the 1970s when she used to ride her horse over from Karula to get her vegetables from the Ladder Market. And we hit it off straight away, we became good friends. And when Annie took over the artistic directorship of TasDance, she asked me would I join the board. And then I spent many years on the board of TasDance and as chair of TasDance, working with Annie to get that company to where it remains today as a recognised frontline Australian dance company. The final thing is travel. I was 57 and had never left Australia. I'd just been caught up in career and, in fact, when I worked for Paramount as Director of Advertising for Paramount, they every second year, had an international convention. And I worked with them for 3 years. Where do you think the international convention was in my 3 years? In Sydney. So at 57, I'd never left the country. And we've made up for that since with a number of overseas trips. We've been lucky enough to go to most of the great wine regions of Europe. And I'm still addicted to it. My wife probably less so. Let me just tell you one story. When we went around France, we often got introductions from, there are many Tasmanians who've worked over there and have good contacts over there. Andrew Pirrie gave us an introduction to Jacques Prieur, AFI, and that's one of the premier domains in Burgundy. It's a big deal. You can't get in there for a tasting unless you've got a serious introduction. So he was able to organise a trip to us to the domain Jacques Prieur. So I was really quite nervous about this, and we pulled up in our hire car, and this young man came striding out to greet us, because we had an appointment, of course. And with my best Australian French, I walked up to him, extended my hand and said, "Bonjour, Jacques." He said, no, he said, "Jacques has been dead for 100 years. I am Martin Prieur." And that was just one of the many, many experiences we had, wonderful experiences we had. We also had an introduction to Veuve Clicquot in Reims, and they sent a chauffeur to our hotel, a personal escort. You know, we really thought they'd got me mixed up with somebody else. But we had some wonderful times. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. How am I going for time? I know I always tend to talk too long. Okay, then in early 2000s I was asked to write for this magazine, Tasmanian Life. So I wrote restaurant reviews and wine column for them for some time. And the publisher came up to me and he said, "Look, we think there's a real opportunity for a a book on Tasmanian food and wine. At that time there hadn't been one, and we were starting to develop a reputation as the gourmet state. So he said, would you be interested in writing it? And I said, yes, I would. So for 3 wonderful months, Sue and I got in the car, went around Tasmania, talking to all the producers from seafood to saffron, and taking photos and putting together this book. We know another one. Providore Island, which some of you may remember. And it really was the first book that addressed the food and wine of Tasmania in a copybook style. And it's a book that I'm quite proud of. I think it was really a landmark in its time. And that came out in 2008. Then, at that time, the wine industry was really flourishing. That's Tamar Ridge, that had only recently been planted. And in a conversation with a friend in the wine industry, she happened to mention to me, you know, somebody should write all this down before these guys die, before the Graham Wiltshires and the Joe Cromies and the Andrew Perrys, while they're still with us, to tell their story about how all this got started, because we were convinced that in 100 years, Tasmania is going to be a world-famous wine destination. And how it all started is important. So this idea started to germinate in my mind, and I thought, well, I'm pretty well equipped to do this. I can write, I know nearly all the people involved, I've done one book, so I decided I would take it on. One of the important things in life is to know your own limitations, and I am an Olympic class procrastinator. I would not get anything done if there wasn't a deadline. So what I did was I enrolled in a master's degree at uni in the history of the Tasmanian wine industry, because I knew that I'd have to finish that in 2 years and it would keep me up to the mark. So I did that, and I graduated in, I can't remember, 2011, thereabouts. And I dedicated the book, when I turned the thesis into a book, and this is the book, which again, I hope some of you are familiar with, Vintage Tasmania, which is the story of the Tasmanian wine industry. I dedicated to these 4 guys. One was Jean Miguet. When the story was that we had a flourishing industry here, well, not industry, that's not quite true, but in the early 1800s, there were vineyards all over Tasmania. Because self-sufficiency was primary in a new colony, every sizeable estate had its own vineyard. And there was a commercial vineyard in Hobart, in Newtown in 1824, making and selling wine. And we were the second oldest wine region in Australia. Sydney was the only place that had wines before. I then found out that the first vines planted in South Australia and Victoria came out of Launceston. A guy called John Barton Hack picked up vine cuttings from a Launceston nursery on his way to Adelaide and planted the first vineyard there. And Henty, when he went to Portland, took vine cuttings from Launceston and planted them at Portland for the first vineyard planted in Victoria. So Tasmania had a quite important place in the early history of viticulture. In 1843, in the government gardens, which was the Lawrence Street end of City Park, there were 43 varieties of grape growing, and they were sold to subscribers of the Horticultural Society. So there would have been an awful lot of grapes planted right throughout Tasmania. So what happened to them? You know, how come we didn't have an industry back then? Well, in my research I found a quote from the Legislative Council in 1878, when they brought in a bill to protect Tasmania from phylloxera, which was a vine louse that was devastating the vineyards of Victoria at the time. And Mr Crowther spoke of the bill. Mr Crowther spoke of the bill as a harmless piece of legislation inasmuch as there were no vineyards to protect in the colony, the greater portion of the vines having been destroyed within the last 4 or 5 years by odium, which is powdery mildew, which they had no way to control. So it turns out that it was really disease and the lack of ability to control it that stopped the industry. But since then, Benaki had a brief go on Maria Island. That was a failure. And that myth seemed to entrench itself that Tasmania was too cold to grow wine grapes. And of course, that was the official attitude of the Department of Agriculture. It wasn't until these guys came, Jean Miguet, who was a Frenchman and from a winemaking background, from a family that made wine, and Claudio Alcorso, an Italian, and both of them came from lands where they knew Tasmania was no colder than their viticultural regions. So they both independently and without knowing each other planted vineyards, one at Lalla and one at Marilla, right in the suburbs of Hobart. The other two people that I dedicated the book to were Andrew Pirrie, who became a good friend over the years. Andrew did a PhD in trying to find the regions in Australia that would be closest to the great wine regions of France, and found northern Tasmania was the answer. Then planted the wrong variety, of course. He planted Cabernet Sauvignon, and it turned out to be Pinot Noir to be the successful grape here. And the other guy was Graham Wiltshire. Graham is no longer with us either, but Graham was a totally self-taught viticulturalist and winemaker who achieved great things, and we can thank him really for the beginnings of the sparkling industry here, because it was his initiative that got Jance started with the involvement of the French company Rodra. And that was the beginnings of what I think, we've got now the champagne of the Southern Hemisphere here in Tasmania. Okay, can I just put in a plug for the wine industry here too? Today, we're the only state where demand consistently exceeds supply. We're the most profitable wine region in the country. All of our wine is sold in that $15 plus bracket. Tasmanian wine grapes sell at 5 times the national average price. The value per litre of Tasmanian wine exported is 4 times the Australian average. So we are doing remarkable things here, and it's all happening, a lot of it's happening under the radar, but it is one of the great shining lights for Tasmania's future, I believe. In the course of the book, or the thesis, I did 50 oral history interviews with all of those pioneers that got it started, so that hopefully in 100 years people will be able to listen to their own story of how it started. So I did actually make it in the end and graduated as an MA, and the book was published, and I'm proud to say that it won the Wine Book of the Year in 2015 against luminaries like James Halliday and Hugh Hook, who were also in the competition. It gave me the taste for research, I suppose. So when all that calmed down, I became an HRA here at the museum, and I've done a number of projects working with John Addison, tracing the lineage of the Australian flag from John West's anti-transportation flag to what it is today, illuminations in the gorge, the port of Boobyalla, which was a fascinating story of a thriving port that has simply disappeared, Chinese market gardens in Launceston, and my most recent one were the coffee palaces of Launceston. There were about 40 coffee palaces here in the 1880s through to the early 1900s. So thank you for listening. I made it within the hour. I've got to just give you a couple more important things in my life. My grandchildren, I've got to give them a mention. They enrich our lives, and we're lucky enough to have them here in Launceston. And that's my daughter Libby that you saw naked in the, both in the bath and in the kitchen sink. And of course, my wife Sue, and I couldn't have achieved any of this without her. The day that I met her was the luckiest day in my life, and we've had 50 years together of married bliss. A turbulent relationship at times, but a very satisfying one. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope it wasn't too boring.
Well, what can I say? A life well lived. Absolutely amazing. I've just put down a few words. The yin and yang of life, you know, coming from the city to the countryside and discovering nature. I wonder if that will happen in the future, and how important it is for those young people in the urban areas to make those discoveries. Courage. Isn't that just wonderful? The over-the-hill syndrome, I think, is fantastic. I belong to a group of walkers. Some here, I think today we call ourselves the Wobblies. Life goes on. It's really important to keep the energy there, and certainly you've brought that to the fore of your life, Tony. Well done, and thank you. All those wonderful characters you've brought alive today, we remember from our past, who made a difference for us in our community. You know, I think of Buck Emberg and George Richardson and Wowell and all those amazing people I'd forgotten about, to be honest, as well as all the areas of the wine industry. I am wondering how much of the Grange you might have squirreled away there. I remember...
The last one on my 70th birthday.
Oh, what a tragedy. Well done. And may you walk and play tennis and enjoy a lot more in the future. So please join with me in thanking Tony Walker very much. And by way of a little thank you, membership of the Queen next year.
Oh, thank you. I'm embarrassed not to be a member.
I hope you would still enjoy that. And just to wind up, a little, unless somebody would like to add a comment, we have a couple of minutes to our talk. I know there are people here who have been followers of Tony's career, so we do have a couple of minutes. Eleanor Austin, President of the Burnie Arts, who is here as a visitor today.
Just a question, please. Is that your book still available for purchase?
The second one is, the first one's out of print. But Vintage Tasmania, yes, is still... In fact, it's being remaindered at Petrarch's at the moment. We made the beginner's mistake. We should have printed 3,000. And the difference in cost between printing 3,000 and 4,000 was so small, we said, oh, well, bugger it, we'll print 4,000. And I've still got 500 sitting in there. So Petrarch's is selling it at $19.95 at the moment.
Any other comment before we wind up? Well, thank you. So just as a little promo for next month, you know that the talks are on the fourth Wednesday in the month, and the speaker for our September event is Malcolm White. Some of you may know Malcolm, very much involved with the Flying Doctor Service. In fact, he's currently the director of the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia, a remarkable man who does remarkable things, in my view. And the Flying Doctor Service, of course, keeps many of our remote and rural communities alive, literally. So the Flying Doctor Service now currently serves the West Coast, so is an important adjunct to living in remote parts of Tasmania. So that will be a very interesting talk indeed. And the following month, just to get ahead of ourselves, we're almost through the year, so that's September. In October, we'll be hearing from Penny Mason. And Penny, of course, has been involved with the university and the art scene all of her career, so that will be another interesting talk to look forward to as well. So thank you very much for your attendance today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And again, thank you so much to Tony and to Sue for making a difference to Tasmania's life, really, and life for Tasmanians.